goal is always to make sure that you are as technically sound and creative as possible while you're shooting. If you have good exposure, good white balance, you will only have to make minor tweaks, and then maybe you can add some color grading or something like that to it. But if you have major issues with your exposure, like it's very underexposed, no matter what you do, the color's not going to look perfect because there's reciprocity failure. There's going to be issues with the color not being able to get there because you don't have that tone there. There's only so much that Adobe Premiere can do. So it's still kind of transferring, but remember, take the time while you're shooting. When you change from location to location, re-white balance. Some people had videos that were not 100% the same color, but it was in the same room. Well, if you're not moving from one side where you get more of the window to another side where you don't have any of that window light, you know, you're not going to need to white balance if you don't move locations. But if you move, sometimes even within one room, you're going to get more of one type of light than the other. So you'll have to re-white balance. And when in doubt, if you're not sure and you're like, well, I think the color might be off, I would just re-white balance. So I know you said some of yours are still loading. But what we'll do today is edit a little bit and talk about color correction. We're also then going to talk about photos, because I know some people have already emailed me and reached out to me saying, hey, I'm definitely going to be using a couple images in my documentary. One, is that okay? And two, how do we do that? So I'm going to teach you how to put in photos into Adobe Premiere and animate them. Not like cool Harry Potter style stuff. That's actually video. But like, how do you make it zoom in a little bit? How do you kind of move or slide or pan between your pictures or parts of your picture? So that way you don't just have like a vertical picture and a black background. I find that to be a little distracting personally. How's your computer? Perfect. I was like, I ran out of ways to stall. So, unfortunately, yeah. You know, if you have your own personal computer and it's ever functioning very slowly, it could be that you are running out of memory and that you need to dump some stuff to your external hard drive and delete it so you have more memory. These software do definitely take a certain kind of computer and amount of memory to function properly. So I'm going to go ahead and start this recording on the computer. So 3, 2, 1, boom, and boom. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Adobe Premiere. Like I said, there are a lot of different ways to color correct, and honestly, most of the time, the person who does your color correction or your color grading, which are two different things, is going to be somebody who's going to be different than the person who might be editing the storyline. Generally, you have one person who edits audio, one person who edits picture. So realize if you really love audio, you can make a career, honestly, of just editing audio. There's a guy that I use to just edit my audio when I do films because he tends to do a really great job. And I only do minor tweaks with the audio so I can see that I like it. But there is different software out there that you can use. Color correction is something that's when you're adjusting what we call a color cast. A color cast means there's too much of one color in the video. Maybe you didn't white balance properly and there's too much of a orange, yellow, red glow, then you can take it out in Adobe Premiere, but again, it's best to re-white balance while you're shooting. Color grading is what?
It's when you choose which color you want the whole thing to be.
It's when you choose what color you want the whole thing to be. Like if you look at The Matrix before they shot it, it does not have that green vibe or green color to it. That's added in post-production. You're not just going to be like, oh, I'm not going to white balance so everything looks kind of green and I'm going to be futuristic and sci-fi. No. You add that in post-production. So color grading is when you're adding a different color or vibe to it and look. Color cast is just removing too much of one color. So before I do color grading, I will do color correction. So that way I can get those out and really manipulate the colors when I'm doing color grading in a cleaner way. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to create a new project. And you can browse. Remember, you always want to set this location when you're working in the lab especially, because if you don't, then all your stuff will be saved to the computer and not your hard drive. Now, we can just pick the desktop if we want, if you don't have your hard drive. Again, remember, you can't do this for the project because it will disappear, but I know some of you don't carry around your hard drive every day like I do. And if you do carry around your hard drive, you want to make sure to have it in a case to kind of keep it protected, because they can and do break and stop working. So I'm going to click on Color Tutorial and say Choose, and say this is where I'm saving my stuff to, this is where my media is, and I can call it Color Tutorial. And then I can make sure my scratch discs are same as project, which is the default, but I always check. There is a little bit of a paranoia that you have sometimes when you edit, like, is everything saved properly? Is it saved to the right location? There are definitely a little bit of things that you want to check to make sure you don't lose anything. And then I'm going to say OK. There we go. So remember, there's different ways you can import your media into the actual project. I personally like using the media browser. That's just me. If you like to import, remember you can just go up to File, Import, or Command-I and import the folders into your project. Do whichever way you want. Just because I like it doesn't mean it's the best way. It just means it's the way that I prefer. So I'm going to go to the media browser. I'm going to go to my desktop. So in order to get to your desktop, you do have to go to your local drive on your Macintosh HD. I'll then go to Users. Then I will go to JCM Student, because that's what I'm logged in as. Then I can go to Desktop, and then I can go to Color Tutorial, and then I can see my video folders. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some color corrections, and then we're going to get into talking a little bit about how to animate images. So the first thing we're going to do is, let's go for the over-the-shoulder phone shot. Let's go for the OTS phone, and let's go ahead and click, hold, drag, and drop to our sequence. Remember, you can always go up to File, New Sequence, and add a new sequence, or if you set the settings that way for the sequence, or if you drag a clip to the timeline or your sequence, it will format it for that specific clip. So now what we're going to do is we are going to make some adjustments and tweak some of the color. You'll notice that, like, when I worked in the newspaper industry for a while, like when I was in high school, I worked at a newspaper, and we had like cardboard coming off our monitors on the side and the top to kind of darken our screen so we could see the colors easier. Now, is everybody in the lab going to let you turn off the lights when you're doing your color? Probably not. Do you have to? No. But for me, I find it easier to edit color when it's darker. And that's why we had those cardboard, almost like barn doors on our monitor. And that's not something I did. It's something my editor did to make it easier. So looking at this video, do you think there's too much of one or more colors in here? Like, is there a color cast?
I think it has some red undertones.
I agree. And where do you see those red undertones?
In her skin.
Mm-hmm. And you can also kind of see it in the ground. It's a little bit pink. So if we are seeing red and light red, it's going to be often in your highlights. But her skin is more going to be in your midtones to your darker area. And one thing you'll notice is that when you remove one color, you'll tend to see that there's actually too much of another color. So since we are editing in color, it is nice to actually go to the color mode. So you can go up to Window and then pick the workspace, or I think why do that when you can just go up here and click on color. And my computer did not do anything. There we go. And so this changes how you view things to make your life a little bit easier based on what you're editing. And we're going to be editing the color. So what we're going to do is, before we start going over what's over here and what it does, is we're going to come over here and we're actually going to add a few things to this window. So let's click on Lumetri Scopes. Currently there is nothing in the Lumetri Scope window, but we can add things that can help us know where there are certain types of colors. So if we right click on it, we're going to add both vector scopes. So we're going to click vector scope. It should, let me double click. There we go. And okay, so you have to double click. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. You have to double click the clip from the sequence to load it back up into the source window. That's why nothing happened. So I clicked on it and I did right click and I said vector scope, which also turns on your waveform. You can also turn on your vector scope YVU, and if I wanted to, I could also turn on my histogram. Now, a lot of this, maybe you might end up only using one of these. So what they're doing is they're letting us know where we have certain colors. We have a lot of colors in the red, like you were saying. So sometimes turning on these scopes lets you confirm your suspicion that, yes, there is too much red. Or sometimes if you just start manipulating it, you'll see, oh, okay, when I take out red, it does look better. So yes, I had too much red. Or if you want to know for sure, again, you can bring these up and we can see there's a lot more red and yellow and not as much blue. You can also see it, this is what we call a histogram. If you've ever shot on a DSLR and they taught you how to use a histogram to see if you have a good exposure, this is kind of a histogram in our editing, except for ours goes vertically as opposed to DSLRs, they go horizontally. So what this histogram does is it lets you know where you have certain information. The top up here is where we have our highlights. The bottom down here is where we have our shadows. And what's in between is more of your midtones, or what we call your middle gray. Your midtones don't always mean it's going to be gray. Your midtones, depending on a person's skin color, could be their skin, it could be their jeans. So we did say we saw a lot of pink kind of in her skin, and also I said kind of in the sidewalk. And you can see here, yes, we do have a spike in our red in our highlight area. So we're going to need to make sure that we take out some of red in our highlights. Down here, we don't have as much in the shadows, and you can see that in her coat. We don't see a lot of a red cast in the darker areas, which is why we don't see a really big spike here. You see a little bit of red, but we don't see a big spike of red down here in our shadow area. And you can see the same thing here. Lots of red. So if you need to get rid of red, what colors would you adjust? How could you adjust getting rid of red? What are 2 ways you could do it?
Add more blue.
Add more blue. It's not the common answer, so I like that that was first.
Temperature.
Yep. You can adjust the white balance, the temperature, or you can just simply take out red. So over here on the right side, you can see we have basic color correction, creative, where you can get a little more creative with it, curves, which is kind of similar to what you see in Photoshop, color wheels, and vignettes and all that other stuff. So we're going to start with just doing some basic color correction. So if you click by the word basic correction, it's going to open up this window. And you have a couple options here. So we're going to talk about it, and then we'll have you edit. So one thing you can do is if you look up here under input, now none of these look great with this video, but I'll show it to you anyway. And if you ever get lost, I'm sorry, I have to face the wall, so you can just holler at me. I don't, they do say teachers have eyes in the back of their head, but not all the time. So if I click on it, you can actually look and see if you are shooting on certain devices or certain settings, you can see that it can go with it. These do not work. So I'm going to just say none. None of these presets work with this camera, work with this footage. So down here you do see white balance. Now, although we can adjust your white balance in post-production, again, remember, it's extremely important to have the proper white balance when you're shooting. So what we can do is we can use it in 2 ways. We can manually drag the colors, or you can use the white balance selector. With the white balance selector, it's kind of like in Photoshop, if you've ever used curves in Photoshop and you have a white eyedropper, it's basically the same thing. A couple things you have to be aware of with it, though. I saw some of you nodding your head that you've used it. What are some things you have to be careful of when you're using the eyedropper to select a color, like to color balance? Is it good to do it something off of something that's very shiny and reflective?
No.
No. Why?
It could maybe overexpose, give it an illusion of overexposure.
It can make it maybe too bright. And if it's something shiny and reflective, it can often reflect the colors around it, so it might not be that great. So you don't usually want to pick something that's shiny reflective. Sometimes in this instance, that might be all you have. The other thing you have to think of is if the white is extremely blown out, like it's overexposed, like you're meeting Jesus, or you have super, super white teeth, it's not going to work. If there is no information or data in that white, the computer has nothing to pull from. So it cannot be super overexposed. There has to be some detail in there. So we're going to click on this eyedropper, and we're going to go try to find something white. Nothing really changed. Now you can see I clicked inside the bag on purpose, and it actually added more red. Why did it add more red? Because this inside of the bag you can see has a blue-green issue, and if you're not careful and you click on the blue, then it's not going to work. Now one way you can reset it is if I only click once, yes, you can hit Command Z, but if you click twice, it will not go back multiple times. If you double click on the dot, it will take it back to normal. So if you ever get into a situation where like maybe I did something crazy and it looks terrible, I could try to drag it back to what I think is the center, or I can double click and it'll set it back to normal. So that's a great thing. So if you use the white eyedropper and you're not getting the change you want, you can actually adjust it manually. So what you can do is, like we said, if we have too much red in our highlights, we can add more blue, or we can take out red. Sometimes you might do a little bit of both. Remember, when you take out one color, sometimes you'll notice you have another color cast. And it could be that maybe you took out too much, or maybe now you're just seeing the other color cast you did not notice. I'm going to adjust the color temperature in Tint, and I want you to do the same thing. But while you're adjusting it, I want you to pay attention to the red on your histogram and the red on your Lumetri scope up here. It should move with it and adjust. To get it to change the Lumetri scopes, for some reason it didn't work until we double clicked it. But now you can see when I adjust the exposure, now we have no information in the highlights because I made it too dark. And you can see that because I went with a -2. So I'm actually going to bring it back to a 0. I think it's pretty good. We have a good bit of information in our highlights. We have a good bit of information in our midtones, which is our medium area and tonal range. And then you also have information here in your shadows. You don't want it to where you have no information in the top or no information in the bottom. Like you'll see this bottom will move up when I start grabbing and moving my exposure. I'm losing that information on the bottom, which is why we have no information down here and we're losing information here. So the exposure I'm probably not going to adjust. Contrast is similar to brightness contrast in Photoshop. Have any of you ever used brightness contrast in Photoshop? Like or dislike?
I drop mine all the time.
Okay.
Like all the way to the bottom every time.
Okay. And it just depends on how you shoot. Like when I edit my photographs, they're different than when I edit somebody else's photographs based on how I shoot and how I expose my stuff. So I'm not going to always edit the way I do on Gary's photos, and Gary's not going to be able to edit the way he normally does based on the way I shoot, the way we expose our stuff. Brightness contrast, I don't particularly enjoy a lot because it adjusts everything. Sometimes I might give just a tiny boost in the contrast because it's going to adjust the contrast of everything. So if we go down lower, you'll notice we have more control. We have the highlights, we have the shadows, we have the whites and the blacks. Whereas here with the contrast, if we pull it to the right, it's going to get brighter, and some parts are going to get blown out. But while we get brighter, you'll notice that we're getting more richness in our tones here. The jacket definitely looks a little bit more rich. Whereas if I pull it all the way down, it's going to start to get almost grayed out a little bit. So I particularly, me personally, I do not use contrast a lot because it adjusts the contrast of everything. But it depends on how I'm shooting. Maybe everything I'm doing does need a little bit of contrast. So then you could adjust the contrast. But I personally like to have more control, so I'll tend to do it in my highlights and my shadows. So while we're doing this, I encourage you to slide things around to see kind of how they adjust. And this is a lot easier because this image is not, or this video is not super overexposed, it's not super underexposed, the white balance wasn't terrible, everything was just a teeny tiny bit off. But when you have things that are majorly off, it can give you a great drastic difference and make a big change and help you. But other times it's not going to look that great because you had to make a huge change. So the highlights, remember, are in this top area. So if I need to, do you think my light areas in this video, are they light enough, or do you think I might need to darken the lighter areas in this video? What do you guys think?
I darkened mine.
Okay, because this is blown out. Remember, if things are blown out, though, it's not going to add information when we make it darker, but it could help us not have it look so overexposed. So I could darken my highlights a little bit if I wanted. Or I could lighten them. If I go a little bit lighter, it's starting to get a little bit too bright, right? Her skin is getting a little too reflective. This is getting a little too bright. So go ahead and play around with your highlights and get it to where you like it. And then you're going to want to adjust your shadows also. I'm probably going to darken my shadows because I think this area needs to be more rich. But I can also do that in the blacks area down here. So I try not to make all my adjustments in one area. Like I would not make all the dark areas adjusted in the shadows. I might do a little bit in the shadow. Then I might come down here and just a little bit in the black and kind of go between the two until I get the look I want. You can adjust it all in one area. I don't necessarily always suggest that. So yeah, the projector is not going to look exactly like what I have on the screen here, so it's kind of hard. Which one do I correct for? What's on the projector? What's on the computer? So again, you can darken it or lighten it. So right now I'm going to give you a little bit of time to adjust your highlights, your shadows, whites and blacks, if you need to, adjust all of them, to get the video to kind of look like what you want it to look like. And not everybody likes the same kind of adjustment. Some people might like stuff to be a little bit more bright and vivid. Some people might like it a little bit more contrasty. But this is just, again, kind of compensating for color to make sure that things look good.
Is there a specific way, like, so say the highlights have a lot of red in them, is there a specific way to just concentrate on taking the red out
Yes.
of the highlights?
Yep.
Instead of the whole thing?
That will be down here in the curves.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, you're fine. It's a great question to ask. So she was asking, if you have too much of red in one area, how do we highlight only one area? We can do that down here in the curves section, which we will get into actually next, because it's more dealing with color correction as opposed to creative is where you can start adding some color casts. I think curves is a little bit better than adjusting it in here. So again, if you ever want to see what it looked like before you did any corrections, you can click the check mark off. We can already see when I turn it off, it's not as rich in color. It's kind of washed out a little bit in some areas. And then when I click it back on, we can definitely see her hair is a little bit darker. I have a better tonal range in my coat or my dark shadowed areas than I did without it. So I'll give you another minute or so and then we will move on to curves. Oh, the other thing you'll notice in this tonal area is saturation. If you pull it all the way to the left, you can see now you have a black and white image. If you pull it all the way to the right, people start to look like an Oompa Loompa. It gets a little bit trippy. Her skin is definitely not that color. However, sometimes I like a little bit of contrast. Maybe I might just add just a teeny tiny bit, but maybe I won't. It just depends on how the exposure is for that specific video or what kind of look I'm going for. So I'll take it back to 100. I think it's fine. Maybe I can go 102. How about 105? Oh, not that. The interesting thing about if you do auto it is a way to be a jumping off point to see if you're like, man, starting out, I really don't know where my color contrast is. I can't really see it. If you click on auto and you notice that it does have, I didn't see a real change in my temperature because I did that. But under here, under tone, it's showing me that, hey, the exposure is actually pretty good. It didn't adjust my exposure, but it did like I did. It darkened the shadows, but it darkened them more than I even did. It also added more darkness in the blacks, and it did also do a little bit in the white like I did. But you'll notice it did not adjust the contrast because that's not going to give you that precise control. So here's what the computer did. Here's what I did. So you can see it darkened it up. Mine was not as dark because I was going to play with that in another area. But that's fine. I would not, like I said, recommend the auto. But in the beginning, if you can't tell what your issues are, the auto will kind of show you by moving those dots in the direction it thinks there are issues with. But you can always go back and double click them to go to the center. Any questions so far? It's pretty simple. Things have definitely changed. When I was in college, this wasn't even an option. Didn't even come with the software. All right, so the next thing we're going to go over is curves. Curves is another place where you can kind of add and adjust some of your specific colors. So with the curves, it's similar if you've used curves in Photoshop. In general, in Photoshop, the upper area in here is what we call your highlights. In the middle is kind of your mid-tones, the stuff that's not your brightest objects or your darkest objects, which are down here in the bottom left. So if I need to make adjustments to just the lighter areas, I would put a dot here and make adjustments. Before we start making color adjustments, you'll need to notice that there are different circles up here above the curves line. The white means if I adjust the curves, I am adjusting all the colors in the video. But if I don't think all the colors in the video need to be adjusted, say, like Olivia was saying that I need to adjust the red, I can click on the red, and you will notice now the line is red. This means that I would only be adjusting the red in the video. So if I think there's still too much red in the highlights, I can put a dot here on the line, and if you pull up, you're adding. If I pull down, I'm taking away. Sometimes one point is enough, and that's all you need to pull out some of the red. Again, I can check by clicking it off and on. You can see subtle changes in her skin right here. So if you're not really seeing it, look in her face right here, as well as, bless you, a couple other areas. So on, off. We're definitely seeing more of a red tone in her skin, which is in the highlight to starting to go towards more our midtones. So sometimes one dot can be enough, but other times maybe you need another dot to kind of pull out some more red. Or maybe I'm saying, oh, I don't want to pull out red here. Let's make sure up in here we have a little bit more. So these different dots can allow you to add, if I wanted to add red in the shadows but not in the highlights, or in that mid-tone range. So the different dots allow you to add or take out based on where you're putting them. So again, if you have too much you think in the lighter areas, you're going to add a dot up here and pull downwards. If you think you need more red in the highlights or in close to the lighter midtones, you're going to pull up. If you want to get rid of a dot,
I get rid of both of them. Is there a way to only get rid of one?
it's the command key. So if you have too many points, if you hit the command key, on some computers it's often the alt key, you'll notice the command key goes from a minus back to the regular command key. I can click on the dot and it will disappear. And I just know that from other Adobe software. So the nice thing about Adobe software is if you know something in Illustrator or InDesign or Photoshop, there's a probability you might be able to have it function similar in this program as well. So if you think there's too much green, you can then click on green and address the green line. Curves can be a little bit tricky when you're first starting out, but it is a definite way to get more control over adjusting specific colors in one area of your video. So the circle will again adjust everything. You'll notice that if I click on this white line, I can pull it inward, which you'll notice inside the colors are a little bit more muddy, a little bit lighter. If you pull the white line outward, it is going to get more saturated, more vivid. I could click on these and it's going to add points to the certain areas. And I could then make adjustments of going inward and say, oh, I need less blue here, maybe I need more green. I don't really like that. So I'm going to double click it to have it go back to normal. If you don't need to have adjustments in certain areas, you can double click and it'll disappear. And if you just click on the line and pull it out, you're adjusting it for everything. You can see when you pull out, like I said, it's getting more saturated, more vivid, a little bit trippy. If you pull inward, it's actually muting your colors and making them less saturated to the point where you're back to a black and white. So this can kind of adjust your saturation. You can also use it to adjust specifics by adding points and maybe making adjustments in certain areas that you think maybe you need less red. Maybe it needs to be less red. Maybe I need a little bit more saturation in my reds. This is one way you can make some additional color adjustments when it comes to saturation, which is kind of like how vivid and bright that color is. I tend to function more in the curves, so I'm going to double click and just reset back to normal. But if you wanted to tweak it a little bit, you could. So I'm going to go ahead and go back up to where it says curves and click on that and close it. And then we're going to go to the creative. Well, actually, we'll go color wheels and then creative and then vignette. And then I'm going to show you something else. So again, over here you have color wheels. So if you still want to make adjustments or you don't like the adjustments options we've used thus far, you have these color wheels down here that you can use to kind of make more adjustments or to be the way that you adjust your colors. So you have one circle for midtones, one for highlights, one for shadows. Right now it's based on where it is now. If I click and hold and drag to a certain color, like say I think I have too much blue, I can drag closer towards red and I'm going to add more red in my midtones. But if I don't like it, how do you think I clear it?
Double click.
Yep, double click. And then now it's back to normal. So some people will come here if they want to make adjustments. So again, you can use all of these options we're talking about. You can also use only one or two of these ways to correct. It's just kind of which way you like best. So I could make adjustments to my highlights here. If I want to adjust the saturation of all of them, in the shadows I can make lines here and say let's make it more saturated, let's make it less saturated. So these bars are either decreasing or increasing the level of saturation. You can see it's getting more rich in my shadowed areas. But again, you can double click to make it disappear. Any questions on these circles? All right, the last color part we'll talk about, there we go, is the creative, and then we'll talk vignette. So the creative, if you look up here, there are some different options. When it says look, this is when we're getting into more what we call color grading. Color grading is not correcting color mistakes. It's adding a certain look or color effect to your video. Like if you look at the original Harry Potter footage, it is not that bluey green kind of tint that they have in the last movie. Or like the Matrix. They don't white balance and just have it look a little green. They add that color in post-production. So you always want to start out with a good white balance, good exposure, and then you can come into creative. And there are other ways you can do this in Premiere, but this is the one way we're teaching right now. If you look under look, you can see there are different presets. I can look and see by clicking on them what it would look like. So this adds kind of a Kodak Fujifilm look. And again, if I want to see what it looks like off, It gives it a little bit of a more film look or coloring to it. I actually really like this. I think this made mine look better. It took out some of the blue. It took out some of the underexposure or how it's a little bit dark in my mid-tone area. So I'm going to let you play around and look at these presets. These are just different looks. So if you want it to be kind of blue because maybe you want that for some kind of sci-fi look, or you want it to look kind of more cold, I could add a blue look to it. So kind of look around and play with these. Blue Steel reminds me of that movie with... Yes, Zoolander, Blue Steel. So you can kind of look around and see. There's different ones. You will not get the option of seeing what it looks like you would over here. If you go down here to Video Effects, and I go to my Lumetri option, you can go to, if you even type up here, the nice thing is with the magnifying glass, if you don't know where something is, I could just put LUM, and it's going to bring up my Lumetri options. And you can see there's different things that I can click on. And the nice thing is here, I can actually see what those colors look like, as opposed to up here, you're just kind of blindly clicking through to find one that you like. Whereas here, I can click on it, excuse me, and it'll kind of show you what kind of effect it will give to it. Like, Cinespace faded film will kind of look more like this as opposed to Cinespace 25. So there are some different options over here that you don't have over there as well. But here I could go if I wanted to more of a neutral. Did I just see the word matrix? I think I did. I'm going to matrix. Matrix green. Dun dun dun. Matrix. So you can kind of play around and look. This one gives it the more matrix blue. Like, I'm just going a little crazy over here with what I got going on. But it's nice because it gives you some options. You can see, if you look, like, I'm kind of a nerd. Like, I like to watch behind the scenes stuff. And I've watched behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings. If you look at the video prior to them doing color grading, it does not look as awesome as it does when they've had somebody adjust it and do some color grading to it. Now, the thing is, we've adjusted one clip, right? And we know that we always adjust our color after we've locked our picture, which means that we've already cut up everything we want on the timeline, and we might have like 20 different little clips cut up. How are we going to make all those other 19 clips look like this one clip? Copy paste. You do not want to have to take a picture with your cell phone and then go in there and type in all the numbers. My motto in life is smarter, not harder. Let's try to make our lives easier. So if we go over here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab another clip and put it on the timeline. This will only work if it is shot in a similar situation or the same situation with the same exposure, the same white balance, the same issues, same lighting. This will not work if I am shooting outside and then I go inside. So this will only work for the shots in the same scene with the same settings. So let's go and let's grab the other OTS one. So I have the OTS phone without a number. Now I'm going to grab the OTS phone with a number and put it on the timeline. So whichever one you did not grab, grab the other one and place it on the timeline. So the first one should be your adjusted clip. The second one you can see is the one that looks like it did in the beginning. No adjustment, adjustment. So what we're going to do is we still want to keep the clip that we have adjusted in our source window. And if you're not sure and you want to double check, you can always look at the name up here in source. It says OTS phone and there is no number. Or you can always just simply double click it again to make sure. If you go to your effects window, your effects control, you can click on your Lumetri color, and I can either go up to edit, copy, or I can just hit Command C to copy it. Then I can go over here to the video that I have not adjusted. I have to get this video back up into this source window because right now it still says I'm on the old video. So I'm going to then double click this video to load it into my source window. And I can see it's the new clip because it says OTS Phone 2. I'm going to go to Effects Control, and then I'm just going to paste that effect. And now, if I play these two clips, we should not see a change in color or filter or look because we've copied it.
Can you do that whole process again?
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you.
I always try to do it multiple times. One at a decent speed, and then I'll go back and go a little slower. So we already have our clip that we've made the adjustments to. So now that you have that clip that we've adjusted in your source window, you can tell by the name, or again, double click. I can go to my effects control. I can go down to Lumetri color because I know that's where I've adjusted all of this. I can then right click on it and say copy. I should probably take a picture maybe and try to do a handout. I'm going to then copy this. Now I'm going to go here to this other one that I have not adjusted, double click it to load it into my window because this is where we can change and alter our effects. Then I'm going to go to effects control and then I'm going to paste it. And now my videos look the same on my timeline.
Where did you click to paste it?
Right click and then just paste. I just clicked in an empty area.
Oh, okay.
Anywhere that's open, you can either right click and say paste, or you can say Command V as in Victor, or edit window paste. And now we have the same videos. Now the curiosity is it going to work if I change it to maybe this clip? Let us see. More than likely not perfect. But let's see how it goes. It definitely looks better and more close to these colors than it did when this was the original. So original, now you still have more of that green-blue vibe that we have in here, so it's more similar. So you might have to make some minor tweaks, but at least I would paste it on there so then I have a jumping off point that's a little bit closer to what it is. So, any questions on that so far?
How would you recommend choosing the first clip to edit?
For choosing the first clip to edit, that's a great question. Nobody has ever asked that question, which is a great question, though. You would think about it. I would pick the one that looks more similar to majority of my footage, because then I would be adjusting most of it. So I'd find one that looks like majority of what I am editing, as opposed to like one where the sky is all blown out. I would probably not adjust that one. I'd go for one where it's like what most of my footage looks like. That's an amazing question. Surprised nobody's asked that. It's a great question. The last thing I really want to show you, I'll show you the vignette. I'm not the biggest fan. The vignette, I think, sometimes is overdone. And then I'm going to show you keyframes, and then we're going to go into how to add images in Photoshop and make adjustments to them in case any of you need to add a couple images to your documentary. Remember, like we talked about, though, in class, majority of your documentary has to be footage you shot. It can't be like pictures that somebody gave you. I mean, we're judging you more on video in this class as opposed to still. So if you, so it needs to be more video than photo. So the vignette, you can see you have amount, midpoint, roundness, and feather. The amount, obviously, if I'm at 0, I have no vignette. If I drag it here, I have more vignette. Or if I go over here, it's actually lighter. So if you drag the amount to the white, tired, right? If I drag the amount to the right, you'll see that it is making a white vignette and lighter. If you drag your amount to the left, you can see it is making it dark. It is a darker vignette. What changes how much of the vignette we see is the midpoint. Right now it's at 50%. If I make it go to the left, you can see it's getting darker. Or if I go to the right, it's going to be softer and it's going to pretty much disappear. So the midpoint is what really adjusts how much of a vignette you add. Roundness, do you want it round or do you want it more oval or do you want it more square? Most people tend to stick into the round area. Feathering, what does feathering mean?
How you want it to fade out or have like a hard edge?
Right. Is it going to fade out or is it going to have a hard edge? Right now it's 50-50. If I go to the hard edge, now you can see a specific line where you have zero feathering and you have a very harsh edge. If I go to the right, you can see it softens it to where you can't even often really see where it's kind of ending, except for that it's a little bit darker. So the more you feather it, the softer it will be. So that is your vignette. I'm going to turn mine off because I don't want it. You can do vignettes. I'm not saying you can't. You just don't want a vignette like every shot. Maybe if you have a dream sequence and you want it to have a distinct look, do it for your dream sequence, but don't do it for the entire film because then it's just a little bit overdone. So the other thing I want to show you is keyframes. We've talked about keyframes when we talked about our audio editing. But the last thing I want to show you is keyframes. So I'm going to go back to my OTS video and I'm going to go to my effects controls. Your effects controls is where you can alter the effects that you've added, add effects. You can also tell us, are we going to have the effect or not have the effect? So if you look up here, I'm going to show you some stuff about keyframes that will kind of go with what we're talking about with the pictures that we're going to adjust.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, if you have already copied your edits onto another one and you go back and adjust the edits, is it going to automatically adjust it on the other clips also?
No.
You have to copy and do it again.
You have to copy. So then you would have to delete it. So I would just click on this and then hit delete and delete it. And then I would paste the new one. But to my understanding, no. From my experience in the past, no. Now, this is a new updated version of Adobe Premiere that I personally do not have on my computer. But what I know of the software, I would say no, I do not think it's going to update all of them.
Okay, and if you need to post or paste edits on multiple clips at a time, can you just select them in your timeline and then, or do you have to do it clip by clip?
From my understanding and my experience in the past, you have to do clip by clip because you have to do it in the effects window. You can't just paste it.
Okay.
You could, I mean, maybe you can drag and drop it on there. Like if I have this open, let's see, maybe if you can drag and drop. Like, can I drag? No, you're seeing it's not even letting me. It's saying no go.
Got it.
Shenanigans. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is maybe there's an effect you want, but you don't want it the whole time. Like maybe you want to go Wizard of Oz and go from black and white to color for some reason. You can do that, but you have to use keyframes. So if you come over here to your effects control, you're going to have more control over how long the effects stay than you would over here in your Lumetri color. If I go over here, you'll notice that when I click on it, like say I'm going to adjust saturation, because I know that will allow me to go from black and white to color. There's a couple things you have to think about. Wherever my playhead is where I'm going to adjust the effect. So I'm going to move my playhead to the beginning of my clip by hitting the up arrow, because the up arrow jumps to the beginning of the clip. You can also see that your playhead is at the beginning of the clip because it's at the very beginning of where the clip is in this effects window. What this little stopwatch does is it allows you to say, at this point, I want something to happen. Now, if I click one time, I'm saying at this point, we are going to start in color. Like maybe we're starting out and the person's very happy, but then later they get depressed and we're going to, pull the color out and make them in a black and white film for a while. Just like with audio, if you have one keyframe, which is this little diamond here, that happened when I hit the stopwatch. You'll also notice the stopwatch now has a little timer right there. Nothing is going to change. If I go throughout the video, it's still 100% color because there's one point. You have to have an additional point in order for a change to occur. You can have more than 2 points, but you have to have at least 2 points. I am now going to hit the keyframe button, which is this little diamond here. You'll notice if I click it, I can add a keyframe. If I click it again, I can immediately delete the keyframe. So I'm going to add a keyframe. And I can, at this point, say, actually, instead of 100%, we're going to go to black and white. So you'll notice it's going to go from 100% color at this first keyframe, and then it's going to fade into black and white. How close your keyframes are together is going to determine how fast this change occurs. What's also going to determine how fast this change occurs is also the percentage. If I go from here, you can see I had a long time, it gradually faded into black and white. I can simply just drag this keyframe over here, and since it's very close, since we're going from 100 to 0, that's a very big change. So it's going to go very quickly. Should have gone a little bit quicker than that, but if I wanted it to go quicker than that, I could just even bring it closer together, and now we can say color and black and white. So the things that determine how fast changes occur between keyframes is the distance between your keyframes, as well as the amount of change you're happening from your first keyframe to your second keyframe. So keyframes are just like we talked about in editing, when we were talking about audio editing. Keyframes are things you will find in other software and in other applications in the industry. So I just wanted to show you the keyframe thing because we are going to use keyframes with the picture editing we're going to do.